Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and welcome you to our home here in Ream Library. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, discussions, programs, conferences, other special events that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find schedule of upcoming events, or you can watch past events online, many of them at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, and in a few days this talk will be online for you to share with your friends or parents or whoever you want to share that with. There's a growing dissatisfaction among the workforce today, if people have seen that. So can it be attributed to changing expectations since the COVID pandemic, or is it an awakening, really, of decades-long weakening of workers' rights and protections, of diminishing take-home benefits in the face of unbounded employer expectations? There's a lot more revisiting what's happening about work in light of that. How do we improve things to move forward in terms of work and the workplace? We'll confront these questions today with Joseph McCartin, a graduate of Holy Cross in the class of 1981. Was a history major, but he told me he came here to study medicine, actually. So history was just a couple of options that he took that turned into a livelihood.
Thanks to Jim Flynn and some folks.
Joe is widely consulted as an expert on U.S. labor, social, and political history. And I'm grateful for the chance today to finally welcome him, having heard so much about him, both from our mutual friend, Professor Dave O'Brien, who can't be with us today because he's presenting another book somewhere, and his brother Jim, who is another Holy Cross alum and a long friend of mine, another professional historian as well, so two historians out of one family. Jim teaches at Fordham. So I'm grateful too that your visit tomorrow will include a meeting with local labor and community organizers in Worcester that Dave O'Brien organized. Joe is professor of history at Georgetown University and executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, which draws on Catholic and Jesuit traditions to develop creative strategies and public policies to improve workers' lives. He's published 4 books: Labor's Great War, The Struggle for Industrial Democracy and the Origins of Modern American Labor Relations. And I was struck in reading the introduction that he said, quote, "The seed for this project was planted as an undergraduate paper that I wrote, presumably here at Holy Cross, with Nick Salvatore many years ago." Another book, Collision Course, Ronald Reagan and the Air Traffic Controllers and the Strike That Changed America, with Melvin Dubofsky, a book, American Labor, a documentary collection, and more recently, Labor in America, which was published in 2017. He served as editor of 4 books, as well as a special issue of the Journal of Labor Studies, Working Class in History. He's written more than 130 articles, chapters, and reviews in the fields of labor history and labor studies. He's also penned a number of op-eds for publications, including the Washington Post, Dissent Magazine, and Los Angeles Times, and contributed to blogs such as Working Class Perspectives. His current research, which he'll share today, explores the twin crises of declining labor organization and diminishing democracy in current efforts to reimagine and revive it. Please join me in welcoming back Joe McCartin.
Thank you, Tom, for that really generous introduction. It is such a pleasure to return to Holy Cross. It's been a long time since I've been here, but it was such an important place in my history. Earlier today, I got to be with my advisor from when I was here, Dave O'Brien. It's so great to see Jim Flynn, who taught me Russian history here. And as Tom said, I arrived here, I came through the gates 45 years ago. It's hard to believe, Jim, right? Dropped off by my parents and thinking I would be a doctor, but going in a very different direction because of the historians that I encountered here, including Jim. And over time, I've come to admire Ed O'Donnell in this department as well, who does, I think, really extraordinary work. It's a special place for me, and to come here and spend some time with you today is really a great pleasure for me. I feel like it's a personally momentous thing for me to come back here and talk today, but I'm also struck by it's happening at a momentous time. at a momentous time, I think, for our country and for the issues that I want to talk about with you today. Issues about democracy and its future, issues about work and its future, and the way those things, I think, very much hang in the balance right now. So I want to talk today about Catholic social teaching, work relations, and the deepening crisis of democracy, but I'm going to do it in reverse order from what's sort of up there now. I want to start by talking a little bit about this moment we're in, this moment when democracy seems rather fragile. In the United States and I think broadly around the world, how many times have you heard in the past few weeks the phrase democracy is on the ballot or democracy is in the balance? It's said by virtually every Democratic candidate, I would say. President Biden has used that phrase himself. Candidates all over the country are doing it, but it's not just Democratic candidates. Conservative pundit William Kristol has made the same point. Even the League of Women Voters, the nonpartisan league, if you go to their website, this is what they have on it. Democracy is on the ballot this year. And indeed, it does in many ways seem like this is a moment for democracy. And it's, it's a moment of great tenuousness, it seems to me, about its future. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Brookings Institution came out with a report looking at the number of people running for office, and again, Election Day is just 3 weeks from today, right? The number of people running for office who believe and argue in public that the 2020 election was rigged and that the outcome wasn't nationally what the Congress said it was, what the courts have said it was, and they point out that around the country there are over 400 candidates in total who believe this, or over 350, about 199 of them. The Brookings Institution says this is on the state level for either state office or federal offices like the Congress. 199 of them have a very good chance of winning. What does this mean in this moment? And moreover, I would say that if you're looking at where those election deniers are most concentrated, it's not in the most conservative states. It's in the swing states. These are the states with the highest number of such folks running right now, and any one of them could tip the balance of the 2024 election. So the fact that so many people denying the election come from those states is, I think, important. To me, when I think about this moment and the threat we're under, I recall a quotation from Alan Benson. He was a muckraking journalist in the early 20th century. He wrote a book called Our Dishonest Constitution. Like Charles Beard, the famous American historian of the time, he really started to look at some of the problematic natures of our Constitution. This is what he argued. The Constitution by no means makes majority rule impossible, but it makes rule by a compact, energetic minority exceedingly easy. Seems to me we're sort of seeing part of the truth in what Benson argued, that you don't need to have a majority in this country to rule. A well-organized majority can rule over a well-organized minority can rule over the majority. But that's just what's going on in politics, right? And that's important. But we shouldn't always or only look in that area when we're thinking about whether or not democracy is in the balance right now. I want to encourage you also to look away from the public world, the political world, to what's going on in the workplaces of this country. Because I think there too, you could say right now, democracy is also in a struggle for survival. The National Labor Relations Board was created in 1935. It oversees the right of many workers, it doesn't cover all, to choose whether or not to be in a union, to invite federal mediators in to conduct an election. What what this board has found is that in the first 3/4 of this past year, there's been a tremendous jump in the number of workers seeking to have union elections. They want to be able to organize or form unions. Some of you probably have been following this in the news about what's happening at the place. Maybe some of you get your coffee, Starbucks. There's been a tremendous surge in organizing at Starbucks, coffee shops around the country. A huge number of stores are now unionized, about 235 as of today. Some are still being counted. The union effort is spreading, and they're winning way more than they're losing. They're, in effect, in this moment when democracy seems to be in the balance politically, demanding democracy where they work. A democratic voice in whether they get to bargain with their management. They're not the only ones. Also, Amazon workers recently have been struggling to form unions, and you might have noticed that just in the previous May on Staten Island in New York, they selected a union. Even as we speak today, votes are being counted for an Amazon facility just outside of Albany. It could become the second unionized Amazon facility. There will be another vote taken at another facility in what's called the Inland Empire of California, probably within the next 6 weeks or so. Amazon workers are trying to form unions. Starbucks workers are trying to form unions. But they are also finding that in their effort to do that, their democracy is also under threat as well. Amazon, for example, has waged a hard war against workers who are trying to form unions at Amazon facilities. So much so that the National Labor Relations Board has repeatedly found it in violation of the law. It broke the law in the first election that was held in Bessemer, Alabama, a year and a half ago. They had to rerun it. The NLRB accuses Amazon of threatening and surveilling warehouse workers. They tried to overturn the results of the vote that happened on Staten Island. It's not just, at the presidential level, in other words, that the outcome of democratic efforts are being challenged. They're being challenged in workplaces around the country. Starbucks is doing the same thing, fighting really tooth and nail to stop their workers from forming unions. These are recent stories. They've all come out within the last few weeks about the things that Starbucks has been doing. I'll just call attention to a couple of things that Starbucks has, just like some of the election deniers, attacking the officials who count the votes. They're attacking the National Labor Relations Board, saying they can't be trusted. They're biased. And they've accused the board of tampering with elections. They, like federal election deniers, have also asked that there be no more mail-in balloting for union elections. So there's a kind of similar thing unfolding, I think, on both the national and the workplace level. And Amazon and Starbucks are not the only ones. Just recently, Trader Joe's, Apple, they've also had union efforts. Chipotle has had a union effort as well. And each of these employers are using every bit of leverage they can to try to, I would argue, frustrate the democratic will of their workers. There's been a jump in unfair labor practices over time historically, and this chart doesn't deal with what's happened most recently. I'll return to it later, but I would argue there's been a jump in recent times here as well. Okay. So, both in politics and in work relations, I think it can be argued that democracy is undergoing a kind of testing time right now. Now, in the time that I have with you today, I want to point out that this is not new, that really for over a century, efforts to seek and win democracy in the workplace and defend democracy in politics have always been interlinked in the United States. And that if you look at the history of what has happened in each of these arenas from 1900 to the present, really, you can trace an arc of progress of greater democracy in the workplace and in politics, I would argue from 1900 to the 1970s. But since then, an erosion of democracy in both arenas. And this has happened in tandem. The linkage between political democracy and workplace democracy is one that has been a kind of dialectic all through this time. And I want to discuss that history with you so that we can talk about the significance of this moment and where we stand right now. So I want to discuss how have these two kinds of democratic impulses been linked over time. Let me start by just saying a few words about the US in 1900. To call the United States a democracy in 1900 is not really accurate, right? It was a place where basically the vast majority of women did not have suffrage rights, where African Americans had been excluded from suffrage, largely. They were in the process of being disenfranchised, and where immigrants and others were having trouble becoming voters as well. You could say that about the US in 1900. You could also say the US in 1900 didn't have a labor movement that was very democratic or representative either. The movement that existed at the turn of that century was called the American Federation of Labor. It was a union of craft workers, and it represented primarily skilled white men. The story of the United States in the early 20th century and up through 1970 is the story about how both of those things changed and how they worked together to bring about that change. That is, workers struggling to build a bigger labor movement, a more representative one, helped widen and expand democracy, and the expansion of democracy made it possible to indeed further widen and deepen the labor movement. A lot of this began to happen in World War I. Tom pointed out the book that I wrote about those years called Labor's Great War. And what I discussed is how this process started back then and how people like Louis Brandeis, the people's lawyer as he was known, helped to bring the instrument of collective bargaining into labor relations for the first time in the clothing industry in New York after a strike in 1910. He helped to create something called the Protocol of Peace, where workers for the first time really got to elect representatives that could negotiate with their bosses in a very stable way. And how that kind of idea was then seized and developed further by a federal board that was created in 1912, the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, to answer the question, why is there so much labor violence in the U.S., which was the most violent country for labor relations in that period, and what can we do to reform it? This board came to the conclusion that the only way to reform our labor relations is to make them more democratic, give workers more of a voice, as Brandeis was doing in the clothing industry in New York. Then came World War I, in which workers had to be enlisted if the country was going to make this a successful war. It was a war that Wilson promised would be a war to make the world safe for democracy. And by making that promise, he was basically saying, labor, this is your war. And workers, as I argued in that book, sort of took him at his word and said, well, if we're fighting for democracy in Europe, we need democracy where we work. And in fact, the government had to move in that direction during the war. For the first time, a federal board was created, the National War Labor Board, that held elections that said you can choose representatives. This is a ballot from one of them on the top of that slide. You can choose representatives to bargain with management. Workers were engaging in a fight for democracy at home in that period, and during the period of the war, this idea that you should be able to elect representatives to negotiate with your bosses really took off. Union membership also grew in that period too, as a part of these policies. And that helped to open up the other part of the equation. As workers fought for greater rights in the workplace, that spilled out into social movements of the time, like the suffrage movement. Working class activism in the suffrage movement, represented by people like Rose Schneiderman, who came out of those New York garment shops, fighting for suffrage in that period, or African Americans who took advantage of the war to move out of the South, where they'd been disenfranchised, to the North, in cities where they got access to factory jobs and maybe got ballots like that one from the National Labor Relations Board. There was a shift that occurred in both the aspirations of political democracy and of workplace and democracy in that period. The same thing happened during the Great Depression and the New Deal and World War II. That is, an expansion of workers' efforts to organize and bargain led to a broadening of political rights. During the New Deal, Senator Robert Wagner of New York passed a crucial bill in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. It, for the first time, created the right for many workers to be able to join unions. It left many out, farm workers, domestic servants, public servants. But by giving this right to many workers and creating an agency, that same National Labor Relations Board I showed you a few clips of at the beginning, to enforce it, Wagner was bringing what he called industrial democracy into the workplaces of the country. And indeed, industrial democracy kind of became the watchword of labor struggle in this period. The head of the CIO's unions, John L. Lewis, wrote pamphlets in which he portrayed what the union movement is fighting for is democracy at work, industrial democracy, and by getting a union and the voice to one, we are widening democracy. Here you see a worker voting for the union at an early NLRB election, and protesters of the period protesting Henry Ford, who resisted a union election in his time, much the same way as Amazon and Starbucks are doing now. And what did the workers say about that? They compared what Ford was doing to fascism. Fordism is fascism. They said unionism is Americanism. This is about democracy, right? And so that struggle to extend democracy in this period, to be able to have the democratic right to vote in that period, was widening the labor movement. And the industrial union movement that emerged, led by people like John L. Lewis, began to bring African Americans and women in for the first time in significant numbers into labor. What was the political impact of that movement? It had a profound impact in opening up space to demand greater political democracy as well. The CIO, the industrial union movement that came out of that period, was the first organization in the US to create a political action committee. This is a poster from its 1944 effort to re-elect Roosevelt that says Roosevelt is our friend. It's significant in part because you can kind of see in that poster the New Deal coalition represented. And at the time, this is actually from a picture of a billboard that was being displayed in Alabama during that election. To have a poster that had a black hand as part of the family of who is part of this movement was a really important thing. The CIO fought against discrimination, and the great union leader, A. Philip Randolph, helped ensconce an anti-discrimination effort into the law or into war policy through executive order, creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee in 1941 as the U.S. went to war. If we're going to fight fascism in Europe, we need to have greater democracy and equality at home. And so there was a kind of dynamic as labor rights expanded, the rights of a widening democracy came with it. I think this happened right up into the post-war era as well, where the expansion of the labor movement and the expansion of political democracy went hand in hand. One of the crucial developments after World War II was that the union movement, which had been confined to private sector workers before that, the Wagner Act had not given any rights to workers who worked for government, to teachers, to firefighters, to civil servants of any kind. In the post-war years, there was an effort to expand their access to the democratic right to choose a union and then have representatives bargain for you. And they won those rights after World War II, especially in the 60s and after. Teachers, postal workers, and others were leading that effort. As public sector union members were demanding democracy in their workplace, this helped to solidify support for the civil rights struggle of that time as well. And here you see on the left, A. Philip Randolph, again, the leader of the largest African-American union of that time, with Walter Reuther, the then head of the United Automobile Workers Union. The coalition represented by the fusion of civil rights struggle and labor struggle in this period was crucially important. I think you could say it reached its apogee in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, when another group of public sector workers, sanitation workers, went on strike, and they had no right to a union in Memphis, Tennessee at that time. There was no legal right for them to even be in a union, let alone strike. Martin Luther King, of course, came to their aid. While in support of them in Memphis, he was assassinated. Their strikes sort of represented the moment when the fight for labor rights and the fight for political rights really was deeply being fused in this period. That's the story of, in a quick summary fashion, how the expansion of democracy on one front helped enable its expansion on the other. But something crucial happened, I would argue, in America in the 1970s, and the period that could be called the long 70s. I've heard some historians refer to the period between 1968, say, and 1981. A whole lot happened, from King's assassination and Nixon's victory to Reagan's victory, and to some of the things that Reagan began to do in the early 80s. It just so happened that that's exactly when I left Holy Cross, in this moment of 1981. To witness some of the things that has happened in the country since then. And in this period, the same kind of mutual, kind of synergistic dynamic that existed between political and workplace efforts continued to operate, but in reverse, so that the weakening of workplace rights and democracy started to enable the weakening of political democracy. And I think that's what we've been seeing for the years since the 1970s. How do we see this? I referred to this chart quickly earlier. There's a huge jump in the number of employers who are willing to just defy the law. The Wagner passed this law in 1935. Workers have a right to have a union. You can't fire workers if they're trying to organize a union. Employers just decided to break the law. And you see a huge jump in the number of what we call unfair labor practices, of doing things like that are found that the employer, yes, they broke the law. They decide to do it. And they do it with the understanding that the penalties against doing that in the United States are almost minimal, to the point of actually encouraging you to do that. Amazon recently has fired about 100 workers. They've closed 10 stores. Let's say they're found by the National Labor Relations Board to have done an illegal act in each of those cases, because if you do that because people are trying to form a union, that's illegal. What will happen to Amazon? Here's what will happen. They'll have to hire the people back. They'll have to pay them any back wages that they would have earned if they hadn't been fired, minus whatever they might have earned if they got a job in the meantime. Will there be a fine for having broken the law? No fine. That's not how it works. And so in the 70s, employers decided, that's good. That's what we're going to do. And they began to fight union organizing tooth and nail in that period. What you start to see is right away the democratic impulse in workplaces around the country diminishing. These are the number of labor board elections that are actually being held, and you can see there's a huge fall off after 1977. That once the unions and employees found that if we tried to go to an election, they're just going to fire you and break the law and do whatever, then you start to lose elections, then you do what the labor movement did, become very conservative. Only go to an election when you have like 80% of the people committed beforehand. And even then, know that the 30% margin above 50% you're counting on, they could melt away because the employer can really intimidate them before the election is actually held. So the unions begin to hold fewer and fewer elections. They actually win more because they're only going to elections when they're absolutely sure. But so few workers ever get a chance now to vote for a union anymore. They're really losing democracy in the workplace. At the same time that was happening, workers were also seeing a collapse of their collective power to do the one thing that traditionally workers had been able to do to get leverage over their employers: withhold their labor, strike if they had to. The strike had been an important feature of American labor relations all through the period since the Wagner Act. You can see the number of strikes sort of goes up and down, but it holds kind of steady until the mid-70s, and then it kind of plummets. Why? Some of that had to do with another subject that I've written about, the strike of air traffic controllers, the PATCO strike. When Ronald Reagan fired federal air traffic controllers, just a few months after I left this campus, he did this in August of 1981. He had a right to do that, first of all, because they were federal workers. They didn't have a right to strike. But when he did it, and the support he got for doing it was so encouraging to private sector employers that, look, the president has done this, we can do this. And they increasingly, after 1981, responded to workers going on strike the way Reagan responded: just hire replacements. Increasingly, workers felt like they didn't have the ability to wage successful strikes, and they simply stopped. Now, you can't sort of overemphasize just how significant that is. There's a graph here that I forgot to include, but I'll describe it to you. What it shows is productivity in the US over time, and how productivity increased and how wages increased. And what that graph shows is, like, from the end of World War II until the late 70s, mid to late 70s, as productivity rose, wages rose with it. What is productivity? The amount that any individual worker turns out, right? And so if you're turning out more product, why wouldn't you get more wage? And in fact, that was what was happening, until workers no longer had the power to compel employers to do that. So what you see after the mid-70s is that the graph breaks. Productivity keeps going up, wages flatten out. Why? I think the graph perfectly explains it. Workers didn't have the power to do it. And much of what's happened to America since I was on this campus before can be explained, I think, by this lack of power, this lack of collective power that workers have had. And as workers don't have the power to really do much, the number of workers who are in unions continues to decline. This is a complicated graph. The overall number of union members is the dark black line. The number of union members in the private sector is the red line. The public sector is the blue line. Public sector workers are still in unions. Private sector workers increasingly less so, only about 5 to 6% right now. So it's an enormous shift and change. So where has that left us? I think what has happened in the story that I'm just quickly summarizing for you right now is that there's been an enormous impoverishment of democratic power of people in the workplace being able to have a voice over the conditions under which they work, having some collective power to be able to negotiate over those conditions. And as that happens, employer power has magnified. I highly recommend a book by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. It's called Private Government, and her subtitle is, I think, explanatory about what she says. How employers rule our lives is what this book is about and why we don't talk about it. And in this book she says, most workplace governments in the U.S. are dictatorships in which bosses govern in ways that are largely unaccountable to those who are governed. They don't merely govern workers, they dominate them. In most workplaces in this country, when you walk in that workplace, know this, there are no free speech rights. There are no privacy rights in that workplace. You don't have democratic voice in most workplaces unless you have a union contract, perhaps. You have, and you are subject to, in effect, a private government. In the early 20th century, Louis Brandeis, he was one of those people who argued that in this century, we will not have a political democracy and an industrial autocracy. You can't have that. Because in the end, if people don't have a democratic voice in the workplace, they are not going to really be able to be fully democratic citizens. Now, what I would argue is that over time that policy, that view has become very, very much, confirmed by events. I think Anderson's book is an important explanation of how this has been happening. Consider some of the stories that maybe you're seeing in the news of late about how new technologies give employers such power to monitor and surveil their workers in today's workplaces. Your boss can monitor your activities even without special software. This recent article, just from a week ago, indicates. As technology is transforming the workplace today, it's doing it in the context of a system in which workers don't really have much of a voice over how it's going to be done. And I think that that's a real big problem. Just in the way Brandeis and others in the early 20th century said, we can't have political democracy and industrial autocracy. So workers have lost their voices in the workplace. Is it any wonder then that we're seeing our political democracy also erode? I think they're linked processes. I think that the one has paved the way for the other. The communication workers is a union that has looked into this issue, and they've identified 4 what they call stumbling blocks to democracy, all of which have arisen in the past 40 years in a really profound way. Money and its role in politics, the Senate's rules, how they're used, voting rights, and then the fact that we don't have immigration reform. Let me just consider those really briefly, just to see why are we in this situation right now where democracy politically seems under threat. Part of it is that even when we elect people, even when majorities elect people, they can't pass things because minorities can stop them from doing it. And you know what? It didn't used to happen in this country. It happened rarely in the years before 1970, only 58 times during the period from 1910 to 70 was either a bill or a nomination blocked by using the Senate rules, but it skyrocketed after that. This is an attack on democracy, I would argue. And then what's happened to money and its role in politics is drowning democracy in the political sphere. Key Supreme Court decisions have paved the way for this, from Buckley versus Valeo, which sort of defined speech, money as a form of speech, to Citizens United that opened the floodgates to dark money in politics. Right now, you can hardly open Facebook or watch television without seeing all kinds of ads that are coming at you that aren't from the candidate. They're from some dark money source and PAC that's been created. And then, of course, Shelby County versus Holder that gutted the Voting Rights Act. So money has paved the way for, I think, an impoverishment of our democracy. And voting rights, as I say, have been restricted in this period. In preparation for and following the Shelby decision that gutted voting rights, about 49 states introduced 395 different bills to make it harder to vote in the years between 2011 and 2015. That's become just epidemic recently, just since 1920, or since the 2020 election. 440 bills in 2021 did that. And at least 19 states passed 34 laws restricting voting. And then I would ask you to think about the fact that we have not been able to create a path for citizenship for immigrants in this country to also be an attack on democracy. Because there are people in this country who are working, who are paying taxes, who are helping make this country work, and they have no voice in it. And the efforts to give them a voice have been constantly frustrated. It's been, some of you were not born when the DREAM Act was first introduced. And it was introduced by the most conservative Republican senator, Orrin Hatch, along with a Democrat, Dick Durbin. They thought that bipartisan bill would sail through. It never did. We're now more than 20 years later. It's still never come to a vote in the Senate. Why? Again, because we can't move democratically to enact things in this country, it seems. Now, I would say that Wisconsin has been the absolute exemplar of what's been happening to democracy, both in the workplace and politically, right? Scott Walker was elected governor of Wisconsin in 2010. He didn't reveal the radical nature of the plan he had in mind before his election. If not, it might have, affected whether he was elected or not. But once in office, he moved very quickly to do one thing, to target the public sector unions of Wisconsin and cut them down. Because he knew that once he did that, he could expand his power remarkably. And so he pushed through Act 10, as it was called at that time. It took collective bargaining rights away from the vast majority of public workers in Wisconsin. It led to a decimation of unions in the state. Before Walker's election, Wisconsin was ahead of the national average in terms of the percentage of its workers who were in unions. It then plummeted. Unions have been demolished in Wisconsin. What impact has that had on politics? Well, this is what happened in the first election right after the unions were taken out. They redistricted the state legislature in Wisconsin in this very interesting way. You didn't have to win a majority anymore of votes to have a majority of representatives in the state house or in the state senate. In both cases, Republicans had a minority of the votes and an expanded number of representatives. This is kind of, I would say, where we're heading as a country, toward a situation where the majority is not in power, really, toward the world that Alan Benson kind of forecast. How can we bend this curve? Can we ever bend this curve back upward? I think history suggests a couple things. One is that we will not, defend and expand political democracy unless we're also looking at this other problem. Because all along these things have been linked. And we're going to have to find a way to also address bending the curve up of workplace democracy if we want to have political democracy. And finally, and as I said, I was going to work through this in reverse order. What about Catholic social teaching? I think history also suggests that the Catholic social teaching, the kind of teaching that's preserved, conserved, and transmitted by institutions like Holy Cross, can play a crucial role in helping us think about how to defend and expand democracy, in part for this reason, that Catholic social teaching imagines a world in which solidarity is important. It thinks about the connections between things. And that's crucial, I think, if we're to address these problems. And I would say at every key moment in the expansion of political and workplace democracy in the 20th century, Catholic social teaching played a supporting role, right? In that early period, leading to Brandeis and others, the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, the U.S. bishops program announced in 1919 after the war called the Bishops' Program of Social Reconstruction. These endorsed the idea that people needed a voice in the workplace. And the advisor to the bishops during the time that they were drafting their social program, John A. Ryan, put it this way: it's important to realize the direction that must be taken, that we cannot, in this democratic America in the 20th century, continue to maintain a system of industrial feudalism, because that, stripped of all its glamour, is the character of the present system. We live under an industrial autocracy, basically, is what this leading theologian was saying, and we can't. We have to fix it. Catholic social teaching made that point in the early years of the century. It made that point in the middle of the century. Ryan, again, was still doing this. Catholic labor schools were created in the 1930s to teach workers who were getting involved in the union movement how to exercise their democratic rights. Catholic social teaching was crucial. In the 60s era, the civil rights era, the Jesuit John Corridon, working on the docks of New York City, if you've ever seen or heard of the film On the Waterfront, he's sort of fictionalized in that character. Or the great labor priest, Monsignor George Higgins, seen here with the leader of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, and Cesar Chavez, the farm worker leader. Corridon, Higgins, they were champions of workplace democracy and political democracy. And I would say that even in the 70s, the Catholic social teaching was being deployed in this period of backsliding as one of the lone voices that was challenging the direction of where things were going. The bishops wrote a big pastoral letter in 1986 on the economy. And in that pastoral letter, which was called Economic Justice for All, they challenged some of the trends that I just described were starting to gain force in that post-60s era. And they were clear that the cause of democracy is closely tied to the cause of economic justice. Political democracy and a commitment to secure economic rights, they are mutually reinforcing, said the bishops. So, where do we stand now? I would say that at the time that Catholic bishop's letter in 1986 came out, that approach was already being marginalized. And indeed, even the bishops themselves would not do very much to promote the quotations that I talked about there after 1986, their emphasis shifted in very important ways, away from economic and structural inequalities, I would argue, and confronting them, into other areas. Now we're standing at, I think, a crucial moment, right? We're standing in a crucial moment, I think, for the history of our political democracy. We're standing in a crucial moment for what is happening in the workplace today, as many workers are struggling to win rights. I think we stand at a crucial moment in the Catholic Church and its history around issues of social justice of the kind that it was articulating in its 1986 letter. I don't see us solving these problems without all of these arenas being part of the solution, without deepening political democracy, expanding it into the workplace, and without a revival of the kind of message that had been more central to Catholic social teaching in the 20th century about the need to confront structural inequalities and empower people democratically to deal with them. Without those spheres working together, I don't think we'll fix this problem. And I don't think we'll fix this problem unless all of us find a way to work together on it as well. And so I want to leave you with that thought. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to entertain any of your questions.